What if the Roman Empire never collapsed? How would the world look today? It's hard to imagine given just how huge of a deal that event was in our own timeline. But Rome did have its problems in the 3rd century that almost caused it to collapse, even having civil wars and losing territory. But somehow they made it through all that. So let's imagine that they got past all those hurdles and kept on going. What kind of world would we live in today? Let's find out. First, welcome to my channel. Now let's get into the time machine and travel back to ancient times. Here are the Romans in 284 AD. They're at the peak of their power right now, stretching from Britain to North Africa. They've already conquered Dacia and are looking to conquer the rest of Europe. As you can tell, this is not a good time to be a barbarian. And if Rome fell here, it would have been really easy. The empire was extremely unstable. The emperors were fighting civil wars against each other left and right. Taxes were high, inflation was high, and people were getting sick of being ruled by distant elites in Rome. There were also a ton of outside invaders who were looking to take advantage of a divided Rome. So Rome could have easily fallen here. But what if they didn't? What if instead of falling apart, they pulled through these next few decades and centuries? Well, first off, the biggest issue for the Roman Empire in this time period was its size. Simply put, it was too big to rule effectively. Because of how big the empire was, taxes took forever to collect and generals had to spend years marching to their destinations. Now imagine trying to do that without a helicopter or even a bike. Also, because Rome was so big, it took forever for news to spread from one part of the empire to another. This meant that the emperor in Rome had no idea what was happening in Dacia or Britain. And because of the poor roads, armies couldn't move quickly enough to stop rebellions or invaders. So the first thing that would probably happen is that the Romans would shrink down to a smaller size, maybe focusing only on the Italian peninsula and nearby islands. They would lose Dacia and Britain to various Germanic tribes, and the Goths would take over Spain and Gaul. The North African provinces would also be lost to various invading peoples. But after a few centuries of stability and peace, they would begin to expand again, this time under a new name. The Roman Empire lasted for around 1800 years, so it would make sense that there would be some changes to how it functioned over time. For example, the government would become more meritocratic rather than hereditary. This means that instead of getting positions of power because of who your parents were, you would get them based on ability. This would mean that competent people would be in charge of things, which would lead to better administration and fewer civil wars. This would also mean that women and non-citizens would have a better chance at having political power since they wouldn't have to marry into a noble family to get it. Also, slavery would eventually be outlawed. Now, in our own timeline, slavery wasn't outlawed until around 1800 AD, but I think it would happen much earlier in this timeline. Here's why. You see, the Roman Empire used slavery extensively throughout its history. At one point, there were around 4 million slaves in the empire, making up about 20% of the population. The reason that Rome had so many slaves is because they conquered so many different peoples, including the Greeks, the Carthaginians, and the Jews. But as time went on, Rome became more and more isolated from these other cultures, and so their influence began to fade away. Without outside influences, the Romans began to think of slavery as simply a way of life. However, as the centuries passed, the Roman population began to decrease, and this led to a shortage of slaves. As a result, slavery became more expensive, and so the wealthy began to buy machines to replace slaves. This trend would continue until slavery was seen as an unprofitable and barbaric practice. Instead of relying on slave labor, the Romans would begin to pay their workers, which would lead to a happier and more productive workforce. Another change that would happen is that Rome would grow in wealth. In our own timeline, the Roman Empire fell during the late antiquity period, which was a time of great intellectual and cultural development. However, this development was mostly limited to Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. The Roman heartland, however, remained largely unchanged. This is because the Roman Empire was focused on military conquest rather than cultural development. But in this alternate timeline, Rome doesn't fall, and so they are able to enjoy the benefits of late antiquity. This would mean that Roman art and architecture would be far more advanced, and so would their technology. They may even develop some sort of early modern weapon. Now let's fast forward to the present day to see how this new Roman Empire would look. Over the centuries, the Romans would eventually adopt Christianity as their state religion, leading to the construction of giant churches and cathedrals across the empire. They would also become heavily involved in missionary work, spreading the word of God to the pagans of Europe. The Catholic Church would become the most powerful institution in the empire, with the Pope having more power than any emperor. Of course, the Romans would keep their love for chariot racing and gladiator games. These spectacles would be even more extravagant than ever before, with chariots made of pure gold and gladiators fighting with diamond-tipped swords. Chariot racing would become a major form of entertainment throughout Europe, with fans traveling from all over the continent to watch races in Rome. Gladiator games would also become extremely popular, with people paying huge sums of money to watch the battles between warriors from across the empire. The Colosseum would be expanded several times to accommodate the growing crowds of spectators. Now let's talk about politics. In our own timeline, the last official Roman emperor was Romulus Augustulus, who was deposed in 476 AD. However, the legacy of Rome lived on in the various kingdoms of Europe. For example, the Spanish kings were still considered Roman emperors in all but name. The same was true of the kings of France, Germany, and Italy. If Rome had never fallen, though, there would be no medieval kingdoms of Europe, and so there would be no need for these titles. Instead, there would be a new title for the leader of Rome, perhaps something like the Grand Emperor or the Imperator Caesar Augustus. The leader of Rome would still be considered the supreme ruler of all Christians, and so they would be very powerful. They would also be very rich, as Rome would still control the vast majority of Europe's wealth. Now, if the Roman Empire never fell, it's safe to say that there would be a lot more Latin speakers in the world. Latin would evolve into the dominant language of Europe, and so everyone from Spain to Poland would speak it. The other Romance languages, such as French, Italian, and Romanian, would probably exist, but they would be minor languages spoken only in small parts of Europe. Speaking of languages, the Germanic languages, such as English, German, and Dutch, would likely not exist at all. This is because the Germanic tribes would never have migrated into Roman territory, and so they would have no need to develop their own languages. Instead, the Romans would either assimilate them or force them to learn Latin. Finally, let's talk about the rest of the world. If the Roman Empire never fell, then the Muslim world would be completely different. This is because the Muslims would have no inspiration for their conquests, as the Romans would be too powerful to defeat. Also, the Chinese and Indians would have no reason to explore the world, as they would know that the Romans would stop them, and so the world would remain largely unchanged. The Roman Empire was one of the most influential civilizations in history, and so it's fun to imagine how the world would look if it never fell. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to check out my other videos on history. Thanks for watching. Bye.